what we're talking about with Dan and Bill.
Segment one's on the national election.
Yeah. All right.
So you want to have, he'll lead on 1, he'll lead on 2, and I'll lead on 4.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski. We're joined today by Dan Bice, one of our columnists, Bill Glauber, one of our political reporters. It's our last show of the year. We're taking next week off, but let's give you a look at what's ahead on the show today. We're taking a deep look at all the year in review from the past crazy year of politics. At the national level, it was all Trump. We'll look at how his election will affect folks here in Wisconsin. At the state level, more dominance for Republicans. What will 2017 bring? Closer to home, we'll look back at what happened at the city and county level elections. We'll give you the winners and losers of the year with a twist. And we'll take some viewer questions, of course, at the end. But we'll start at the top with the national level. So a year ago, everyone was talking about, Donald Trump's bound to fade. He's going to fade soon after this.
In fact, people here were saying
primary. People even around this table. So what have we? And he, of course, won. But what have we seen from him, Bill, since the election? Do you think that gives us insight into how he may function and govern as president?
Well, first of all, as I've said to Dan and maybe you before, Trump is very fortunate he's not an NFL player because he would have been penalized for too much celebration. His victory tour, which he brought here, was a sight to behold, rousing his base but not reaching out to others.
Do you think he'll continue to do those rallies?
He
loves those.
Yeah, he does love those. So that that is part of the issue, part of how Trump operates, and it will be interesting what he brings to Washington. Whether he'll compromise with Democrats, try to include Democrats, or go all Republican all the time. So I think that's what we're looking at. But as far as 2016 goes, he is the story, and what he brought to the national level and also to Wisconsin, worked his tail off and beat Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin by, some 22,000 votes. There was even a recount over that because of Jill Stein. So, quite unprecedented. The first Republican to win the state on the presidential level since 1984. A huge
So, Dan,
win.
what's your sense of, so we've seen Trump in action now as a president-elect. He's made cabinet picks. He's gone on his
billionaires and generals.
Victory tour. But what can we glean from that in terms of how he will he be more of a compromiser? Will he, as Bill said, will he go all Republican and go hard right, or what do we think?
Clearly, the voters have handed the car keys to the Republicans, and the question is, what will they try to do with this? In the state, that's an issue as well, but the concern is always, is there going to be overreach? He's laid out some of his agenda and what he wants to do. How far will they go? And then secondly, the thing that I'm interested in is, he got elected with the support largely of the white working class. Yet his cabinet so far has been very traditionally Republican. A lot of wealthy white guys or people with military backgrounds. So what does he do? Does he do anything to respond to the concerns of the white working class? And in particular, what's he do with trade, tariffs, those sorts of issues? Does he push those issues, or does he just act like those things never came up during the election?
Well, let's talk a little bit about two prominent Wisconsin Republicans who have even greater roles now, perhaps, than they did certainly at this time last year. You have Paul Ryan as House Speaker, Reince Priebus, the Chief of Staff to be. How does that affect policy and things here? Does that give Scott Walker a good ear to get things done? Does it mean more? I mean, typically, you say, "Wow, that's a great news for Wisconsin," right? You've got these two high-ranking.
Well, it's
folks,
great news for Wisconsin, I think, if you are a Republican and if you believe in this drive towards federalism, bringing Medicaid back to the states in a bulk cash, more state control. If that's what your belief is, then it's good news for the state.
And Scott Walker has suggested he does like that.
Yeah, but there would be Democrats who don't like that, and who want power maintained in Washington and want more federal control because it supposedly by Democratic standards would level the playing field nationally. So there's quite a bit of skepticism on the left of the drive towards federalism.
Even though the Republicans have been given the car keys and are in charge of things, there's still going to be issues within the party, and I think it's illustrated by Reince and Paul Ryan on the one side, who are traditional conservatives. You also have this issue of infrastructure, which even in his rally here, Donald Trump brought that up again, that he wants to spend $1 billion on infrastructure.
No, $1 trillion.
$1 trillion on the infrastructure. And you can bet that Priebus and Ryan are not fans of that. So how do they respond to those things? And then secondly, when the Obama administration tried to send money here for trains, obviously Scott Walker rejected that. So, I mean, that's another issue where you're going to see, I mean, there are good things, but there's also divisions within the party.
No, I would say there are, and I would reemphasize this, there are good things if you are a Wisconsin Republican and believe in the agenda, believe in the Ryan budget, which, let's face it, 6 years ago, nobody wanted to sign on to it, 8 years ago. He had very little support in the Republican caucus for that first budget. So, this is, even though it's popular within the Republican Party, it's not necessarily popular statewide by the entire state.
And Obamacare. I mean, I think a lot of Republicans are reading this as a mandate on Obamacare to reject it, but a number of voters who supported Trump seem to still sort of like aspects of their health care plan.
Yeah, it would be called insurance.
All right, another at the national level, I mean, it's happened in the state with Ron Johnson getting re-election, but it's a national level office, and he's now going to have a little more tenure in Congress and still keep his chairmanships and things. What can we expect from Ron Johnson in the next year?
Well, I think he found his footing as a senator in the last 2 years, especially once he took over the Homeland Security Committee, and he has Homeland Security and also has oversight over government. So I expect him to continue to be a very important player in Washington on the issues he cares about, which is security, which is oversight of the government. And he has grown into being a much more effective senator.
Ron Johnson went from
years.
being a largely irrelevant senator in his first 4 years in office, a guy who spent most of his time putting together PowerPoint presentations and charts that no one paid any attention to becoming an activist member of the Republican caucus. And I expect that to continue. He's going to continue to be, he likes sending out letters, he likes issuing orders and trying to get to the bottom of whatever situation interests him. The issues that do interest him, sometimes a little weird. I don't understand his interest in vaping, which I think he's now sent 3 letters on. And
there is the vaping, and he's not a smoker.
He's not a smoker, but you have weird issues like that. But then other times, national security issues do interest him as well. So I expect him to be very active in the next 6 years.
And he just made a tour of Israel over several days, looked at some of their border security. Israel's basically fenced itself from its neighbors, and that's a fencing situation that could be used on the southern border. The fencing, not the big walls.
It's a job he likes. You sort of see him growing into it. He seems to be learning stuff on the job. When he was first elected, he was not, he was not the most knowledgeable person about worldly affairs, but it seems to be something that interests him a great deal right now.
All right, we're going to have to move on at this stage. We have a segment, though, before we get to the state level politics from this past year that looks at the top fact checks from the past year from PolitiFact Wisconsin. So it was a crazy year in politics at the national and local level and a crazy year in fact-checking. So we're joined now by PolitiFact reporter Tom Kircher to look at our top 10 fact checks from this past year. Now, these are made based on the clicks that they received by readers, not by any judgment of our own in terms of what's best or worst.
Right, online page views.
Yeah, page views. We're going to go in reverse order. Number 10, Sean Duffy says Wisconsin has only one county, Dane, that's hand counting the votes in the 2016 presidential recount, and that was rated pants on fire.
Actually, Dane County and several dozen other counties that did the recount by hand.
And that was well known and announced at the very beginning of it. This
That's
is an
right.
older one that came back into play. National Black Chamber of Commerce president says the National Rifle Association was, quote, founded by religious leaders who wanted to protect freed slaves from the Ku Klux Klan, and that was also rated pants on fire.
Yeah, the NRA itself says it was formed by Union Civil War veterans to help soldiers with their marksmanship, and there's just no evidence of any relation to slaves or KKK.
All right, number 8, Ron Johnson, the U.S. Senator, says that before the terrorist attacks in Benghazi, the State Department not only failed to honor repeated requests for additional security, but instead actually reduced security in Libya, and that was rated true.
Both parts are correct. The State Department in Washington did refuse requests from Libya for more security, and also turned down an offer from the Defense Department to keep security units there for a longer period of time.
All right, number 7 is from a series of tweets that were floating around. The tweets say the Republican Party has not won a presidential election without either a Bush or Nixon on the ticket since 1928, and this obviously was before this election,
Right.
And that was rated true.
Yeah, you have to go back for the Republicans who were the winners. You go back to Richard Nixon, who ran as a vice presidential nominee and for president, the elder George Bush, who did the same, and then George W. Bush, who was, of course, elected president.
All right, number 6, Scott Walker says 6 of the nation's 10 wealthiest counties, according to median income, are in and around the Washington, D.C. area, and that also was rated true.
Yeah, 6 of the top 10 counties in terms of median household income were in the suburbs of D.C. in Virginia and Maryland.
All right, number 5, Bernie Sanders says the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, and that was rated mostly true.
He was accurately citing a study by economists that was backed up by other economists we talked to. The only wrinkle is that study didn't include Social Security income.
Okay. Number 4, Donald Trump says Hillary Clinton once wanted a wall on the Mexican border, and that was rated half true.
When she was a senator back in 2006, she voted for a law to put up fencing around about 700 miles around the country, but not a wall nearly as extensive as what Trump wants.
All right, number 3, Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, says repeated requests for additional security in Benghazi were routinely denied by Hillary Clinton's State Department. So it was very similar to the
Right.
Ron Johnson statement, and this is also rated true.
Yeah, the only thing to point out here is that while the State Department did refuse requests for more security, there was no evidence that Hillary Clinton herself had denied the request.
Number 2, Reince Priebus says Hillary Clinton took money from kings of Saudi Arabia and Morocco and Oman and Yemen, and that was rated half true.
3 other nations did make contributions to the Clinton Foundation, but not money given to Clinton herself.
All right, and finally, number 1, this is our most clicked fact check from the past year. Reince Priebus says Donald Trump's presidential victory was, quote, an electoral landslide, end quote, and that was rated false.
At that time, there were 306 electoral votes for Trump, and that's much closer to the narrow victories by John F. Kennedy or Jimmy Carter, not anywhere near a landslide win.
Yeah, so what was interesting to me about this, Tom, was that it wasn't so interesting that it was all presidential primarily, as people were so interested in the election, but there were so many that were true and mostly true, which goes counter to what we usually see as pants on fire and false draw the most attention.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have too many true ratings for all of our fact checks, but I think that's part of the attraction is when people see that rating, it makes them even more interested to see what the fact check is about.
All right, well, you can read all of these and more at politifactwisconsin.com, and we'll be back for more fact checking in 2017. All right, so we're going to turn our attention now to state-level politics from the past year, and we're joined by Jason Stein from our Madison Bureau. So, Jason, let me just throw out this general question for you at the top here. What, in your mind, was the top story in state politics from 2016?
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that it was the Republican clean sweep on November 8th at the ballot box. Obviously, you had Donald Trump, Mike Pence, legislative Republicans, U.S. Senator Ron Johnson winning re-election. It was really a stunning series of victories for them, especially when you think back to April 6th, I think, was the state presidential primary. Donald Trump lost that primary. And really had run, in many ways, against popular Wisconsin Republicans. That didn't really work for him all that well over the summer and early fall. But then you really saw Republicans come home to him in the final days of the campaign, and him win a victory that, at least if you'd have looked at it in April of last year, or this year rather, would have seemed very unlikely, and that, but by the end had come to pass.
Yeah, so Dan, let me ask you, so last year at this time we were talking about Scott Walker and his failed presidential campaign, and he had terrible approval ratings, and what was he going to do going forward? How did he do this year in terms of positioning himself to keep being relevant and important?
Well, actually what he did was ride the wave. I mean, this has been a Republican wave. He's still not incredibly popular. Most recent polls show him at 43, 44%. But it's clear that he's planning to run for another term, for a third term. I think part of that's outside his hands, because if Trump had lost, then there would have been a number of Republicans thinking about running for president. But now that position, that option is not available to him. So, and on the other hand, Jason was saying that the story of the year was the Republicans. The reverse of that is what happened to the Democrats. I mean, this was perhaps. It was just a terrible year for them, from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket, from Russ Feingold and Hillary Clinton all the way down to the legislature, where they lost seats everywhere. It's incredible.
So where do they go to get a foothold back into relevancy and power here in Wisconsin?
Well, it is true that Scott Walker's going into 2017 is not one of the most popular political figures, and so what they have to do is figure out what direction they go. Martha Lanning, the head of the party's already announced she's running for re-election. So do they think that she's the way to go in the future, or do they change directions? Do they keep their close relationship with labor unions, or do they find a candidate outside of Dane County and Milwaukee County, which they seem to have a hard time doing?
Yep. Jason, let me ask you on one of the other big stories that played out throughout the year was Lincoln Hills, that at this time last year was just sort of being revealed and coming to the public's attention. Do you have any sense of how, are we closer to a resolution there in terms of these investigations? Will they be over? Will reforms get passed? Is that issue sort of going to linger on into next year?
Right. So obviously Lincoln Hills is the state's only prison for juveniles, and it's located a half an hour north of Wausau, up in the North Woods. We at the Journal-Sentinel particularly have been documenting a whole series of problems and even potential criminal and civil rights violations at that facility. And we've had an criminal investigation that now has been going on almost 2 years and involved all the way up to the FBI. I think there's really two outstanding questions. One is, are there going to be criminal charges, and how far up would they go, number one? And then number two, are policymakers from Milwaukee County Board Supervisors all the way up to Governor Scott Walker going to use this scandal as an occasion to sort of overhaul juvenile justice in the state? Because right now it costs $100,000 a year to keep a teenager in this facility. And when they come back to the communities that they're from, which is often Milwaukee and Racine, places like that, they often commit other crimes and are right back into the system again. So, at the county level, there are what appear to be cheaper, better options available, and it's a question of whether or not the state's going to employ them.
All right. Well, 2016 moved fast on a political level, and our show is moving fast. We're going to leave the state discussion there right now and turn to this segment on local politics from the past year. Thanks, Jason. We're going to turn our attention now to the local level at the city and county and all the local politics. We didn't have nearly the same upheaval we did at the national level. In fact, Tom Barrett, if you remember way back to April, was re-elected mayor, and Chris Abler re-elected county executive. We're joined by Mary Spicuzza, who covers Milwaukee city government for us. So, Mary, one of the changes that did happen back in April was we have a new Common Council president, Ashante Hamilton. How has he fared in the job so far?
I think that he's a very personable person. He's been around for a while. He seems to have a good working relationship with the mayor's office, much like the previous council president, Michael Murphy. I think that probably critics and opponents of Mayor Barrett probably would like him to have a more combative relationship. They really have not, but he's done okay. It's a tough council because there are some, far more liberal, which you would expect in the city of Milwaukee, but also the South Side conservatives who do not see eye to eye on policing issues and a number of issues.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it, because one of the things that brought Ashante Hamilton to that role was this coalition of sort of central city aldermen from the north side primarily and some south side conservative aldermen. Has that coalition been holding up? Or is it?
They called it like bridging the north-south divide. No, I would say it has not held up, and I think it would have been more surprising if it had held up. But we've seen some divisions really early on. There was a kind of more unified effort to try to oust Rocky Marcoux, saying that he was too focused on downtown and not enough on the neighborhoods. That fell apart. Then in the wake of the Sherman Park violent upheaval, some of the comments from Alderman Donovan were not well received by some of the North Side alders. He did this public safety plan, which got a lot of criticism as kind of a Sheriff David Clark wish list, and it's really kind of fallen off the radar. It went from being a public safety action plan to just the start of a dialogue. They had community hearings about it. They did a public safety survey, which has been released, but it's kind of, I think a lot of alders wanted to distance themselves from it, aside from Donovan, who really stood by it.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit more about the Sherman Park, the riots and violence there, because that was certainly the headline that people across the country will probably remember about Milwaukee this year to the degree they do. Has there been any, in the wake of that, and this involved the police shooting, and the officer was recently charged in that matter, and had previously charged in a different issue, but I mean, has there been any consensus among the mayor's office and the council on how to respond to that in terms of, are there different changes needed in the police department or programs, or any unity there, or has there been more discord in terms of how do you respond to the violence?
I think in the case of Sherman Park, we did see Mayor Barrett working with County Executive Abley, working with even Governor Walker, who has had they obviously have not always had the best relationship in the past and have run against each other. But I think we did see a lot of local and state officials coming together to try to address some of the problems facing Sherman Park and some of the lower income areas of the city. And we've seen efforts to try to tear down some of the houses. Obviously Milwaukee had a huge foreclosure crisis, and we've had a lot of zombie properties, abandoned properties that are really falling into disrepair and harming neighborhoods. And you have drug activity or other things going on. We've seen some educational initiatives. It's obviously more needs to be done, and if you look at the grand scheme of the state's budget, it's obviously a really small percentage going to Sherman Park, but I think the idea was that it would be a start to do it immediately this year, and then we'll see how it goes heading into the next budget.
All right, and finally, let me ask you, thinking back on some of the headlines from the past year, we had the brouhaha over the strip club, and could it be located, where it would be located. You have lead in the water and the pipes, the responses there. Estherbrook Dam affected the county and the city.
Right.
Craig Peterson, the lobbyist, kind of getting his fingerprints on the election. Which of these headlines do you think will we still be talking about next year, and which of these are just sort of done issues?
It's probably all of them. I feel like we'll still be talking about lead, not only lead in the water, but lead paint. The city has the initiative against lead in the water is newer than the lead paint, but I think both involve problems with absentee landlords, which we've been covering, and Carrie Spivak and Kevin Crow have been covering, especially of there are a lot of absentee landlords in Milwaukee who are not dying to either repaint houses or remove and replace lead pipes. So I think we'll be talking about lead. I think we'll be talking about strip clubs. The city, paid a huge amount of money to settle this lawsuit, and I don't think that strip club owners are going to go away or stop trying to open downtown. So we'll see I think that there's a real concerted effort to stop the bleeding of taxpayer money to strip club owners who just say they want to open downtown. So I think we'll be talking about all of that. I think we'll certainly be talking about Greg Peterson in the coming year.
At least the Estabrook Dam, that'll be done,
that's
right?
probably gonna-
It's going to probably be down, but there may be, who knows,
lawsuits.
what
I
lawsuits
think
and things
lawsuits
after
of
that,
people
so.
who want the dam. There is a small. I would say it's a small but very vocal and very active community of folks who want that dam to stay. And
So what we're going to do then, as we wrap up here, is we're going to save this part of this
Sure.
segment. We're going to just rerun it a year from now,
maybe
presumably,
a
to
year
say
from
this is
now there
still
will be
going
no
on.
Estabrook Dam, but
All right,
we'll see.
We'll see. All right. So thanks for joining us, Mary. And that's our look at what's happening at the local level this past year. All right, so now we're coming toward the end of our show. I wanted to look back at sort of winners and losers. We have a little bit of a twist because it's too complicated to just have one of each, right? I mean, it's such a busy year. So Dan, here's one. I have a trade-off questions for you. Whose star was on the rise after? Here we
I think
are
obviously
in
Reince
2016?
Priebus is on the rise. Ron Johnson's on the rise. Locally, Chris Abele is on the rise. Won re-election, did very well this year.
And let me just interject, Congressman Sean Duffy, outstate, out of Wausau, on the rise.
All right, and Bill, whose star is falling at this point?
Well, I covered it. Russ Feingold, the former U.S. Senator who lost in his bid to get back to the U.S. Senate. Alderman Bob Donovan, who ran, by all accounts, just not a very good mayoral campaign.
And now is being called out by the head of the Common Council, Ashante Hamilton, on stuff. I mean, yeah.
The guy who, that was that coalition we talked about, Mary,
Right,
who helped
the now
bring
non-existent
Ashante
coalition.
Hamilton
So,
down
and
to
then
town.
state Democrats in general.
And yeah, they were losers, obviously. They lost an assembly seat that nobody even knew that they could possibly lose. And then State Senator Jen Schilling, the leader of the minority Democrats in the state Senate, won her race against Dan Kapanke by a handful of votes. And I mean, you could put them in your hands. That's how close it was.
All right, so Dan, the question here is, who responded best to a crisis? Or is that claim, don't ever let a good crisis go to waste? So who didn't let a good crisis go to waste?
I mean, there are two that come to mind. I think that Ron Johnson had his own personal crisis where it looked like there was no way he was going to win.
He was left for dead.
And in August, he turns it around and ends up winning. And then secondly, I think local officials, in response to the Sherman Park riot, which was a riot, that didn't blow up, and they were able to bring it under control. And I think that the sheriff's office...
It blew up, but they were, in all seriousness, this was a 2-day, 2-night,
Right.
terrible
It had the potential,
situation.
and
it had the
other communities
potential to
went
go
on for weeks,
and,
yeah.
and it didn't. And in the meantime, since then, of course, they've leveled charges against the police officer involved
So it's
in
been
the
slow and methodical, but very effective, I think.
All right, and Bill, who, in your mind, responded worst to a crisis?
Well, that
this
would be
past
the
year?
biggest loser of the political year, Hillary Clinton, who was the Democratic nominee for president, was one of the worst candidates of modern history. I would put her with Michael Dukakis and perhaps even Tom Dewey back in 1948 against Harry Truman. At every juncture of that campaign, when she needed to go big, she didn't. It was terrible.
And we now know that the Clinton campaign was aware that there was trouble in Wisconsin, but they didn't come here. Hillary didn't come here. Hillary Clinton didn't come here from April. It has not been here since the April election, and decided not to come here because they thought it would demonstrate some sort of weakness locally.
And I know Democrats will be upset with us saying this, and but it is the reality. And what we did see this year were the deaths of two political dynasties, the Clinton dynasty and the Bush dynasty, even though there's a younger Bush in Texas.
Let me go with one more here before we try to get a viewer question or two in. So whose 15 minutes of fame is over?
Rona Swanigan, who ran for district attorney, lots of attention, more than $500,000 spent trying to get her elected locally. Gone. And there's talk that she might want to run for judge, but I think her career is over.
Got any dispute with that one? Do you
I
even remember
no,
Rona Swanigan?
I remember the poetry.
I try to get it out of my head.
Yeah, okay. For our regular viewers, you'll be able to appreciate that one. If not, I guess Google's available. Viewer questions. Now we're going to throw in one quick one here. This was from Frank on Second Shift, who says, his question is, whatever happened to the Tea Party? They're not in the news anymore. What happened to the Tea Party?
I think
They sort
they're
of
in
become
they're
the
in
party.
power,
Right.
aren't they? Yeah, they're
Right.
not in the news. No, they're running the country.
I think they come up with different names over time. The Reagan Democrats was the name for them. Tea Party Republicans was their name now. Now we just talk about the white working class, but it's pretty much the same group, and they're in power. And I think Mr. Bannon is their representative in the federal government.
Can I say I went to one of the first Tea Party rallies in the country? It wasn't called that. It was right after Barack Obama's election. Several of the main speakers, you know who they were? Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, David Clark. And it was down at the convention center, and that was a meeting that eventually led to the Tea Party.
Not long after that, Ron Johnson started appearing at those events.
Yes.
All right, so that's where we're going to leave our show, and this is our last show of the year, as mentioned earlier. We'll take next week off for a long winter's nap and be back in January to look ahead at 2017. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next year.